Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Sheila Parkins, and I am the Homeless Stabilization Program Analyst in the Homeless Services section. I'll be providing your program training today, and this session will focus on the Housing Stabilization Program. Since this is a pre-recorded training, you will be able to pause, back up, fast forward, and watch this at any time, any day, and it will remain available for the duration of the biennium. Use this training for new staff or as a refresher to current staff anytime to meet your needs. So let's begin. Listeners of this training will not hear information about how to submit a Smart Sheets or information related to general requirements within Smart Sheets or the HSS program standard guidance. This training will also not cover the HSP reporting submission process. More information and training on those topics are available on our main MGA dashboard. Feel free to watch those videos as needed. This training will focus specifically on the HSP program and will provide information relative to the program's requirements and allowable costs. The first item of note as grantees review relevant manuals is that each program's statutes, rules, contract, and guidance are meant to express how funds are intended to be used for that program. And if a statute, rule, contract, or guidance does not expressly prohibit an activity or an expense, it does not mean that that activity or expense is allowable. Failure to check with OHCS in advance of using funds to cover something that is not addressed in statute, rule, contract guidance, or manuals may disallow costs and result in a requirement to repay funds to OHCS. We don't want that to happen. So follow the guidance carefully. And if there are any questions, please contact OHCS through the OHCS gatekeeper or through the program's program analyst. A contact list of everyone, all the program analysts, is available on the main HSS dashboard. It's also important to remember that each manual is specific to the program for which it was created, and nothing in the manual applies to other programs, and nothing in other program manuals apply to the program that we will discuss today, unless it's expressly identified in the manual, such as the HSS program standard guidance, which applies to all HSS programs. Information is not transferable between manuals. So again, if there are any questions, please contact us. The purpose of HSP is to quickly identify and engage people at risk of and experiencing houselessness, to prevent people from losing their housing, and to divert people from entering the homelessness service system, to provide people with immediate access to services, and to quickly connect people experiencing houselessness to housing assistance and services tailored to their unique needs and strengths, helping them to achieve and maintain stable housing. It's important to recognize that OHCS removed all common elements of each manual and put them in a single location called the Homeless Services Section Program Standards Guidance, or the HSS Program Standard Guidance. These program standards apply to all homeless service section funding, and any failure by the subgrantee or their subrecipients to adhere to these standards will result in audit findings and may put the subgrantee's funding at risk due to non-compliance issues. Again, subgrantees can watch the training video we have on required documents and program standards training for more information on those standards. Please be sure that subrecipients also understand this shift and follow the HSS program standard guidance. HSP provides temporary financial assistance and support services to stabilize the housing situation of TANF recipients who are houseless or unstably housed. For the purpose of HSP and throughout the manual, TANF recipients refers to the temporary assistance to needy families eligible recipient as determined by ODHS through the interagency HSP referral form. This is not an eligibility factor that is determined at the subgrantee or subrecipient level, but is determined by ODHS through the use of the referral form. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for the TANF program provides assistance for one of four following purposes: assisting needy families so that children can be cared for in their own homes, reducing the dependency of needy parents by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage, preventing out of wedlock pregnancies, and encouraging the formation and maintenance of two-parent families. Pursuant to 45 CFR 260.31 and through the interagency agreement with Oregon Department of Human Services, the Housing Stabilization Program assists the TANF program to meet purpose number 1 with non-recurrent short-term benefits that deal with a specific crisis situation or episode of need and are not intended to meet recurrent and ongoing needs and will not extend beyond 120 days from the date of the first HSP financial assistance payment. HSP requires subgrantees to identify and match grant funds with TANF Maintenance of Effort, or MOE funds, in an amount identified in the funding application for each subgrantee to meet. TANF MOE funds must not originate with the federal government and are not intended and are not expended as a condition of receiving federal funds under another program. More information on MOE is coming in later in this presentation. Subgrantees and their subrecipients are required to have a signed release of information form from each adult member of the household authorizing the release of information pertinent to determining program eligibility, providing assistance and services, and other relevant needs for sharing information. Each adult member must complete and sign their own ROI, and ROIs cannot be shared with other household members. Unaccompanied youth who are the head of the household must also have a signed ROI form on file. Release forms must be time limited with at least a 3-year period to cover the period of monitoring requirements and specific as to whom and what information will be shared. The Oregon Housing and Community Services and Oregon Department of Human Services are required to be listed as entities with which participant information will be shared as it pertains to data collection and monitoring, including third-party audits and reviews. Although this requirement can mean they are both listed on the same form, or you can use separate ROIs for each agency. In addition, any release of information form for the purpose of releasing information to OHCS and ODHS must include the option of alternative formats, including native languages, Braille, large print, computer disc, and oral presentation. The MSC 3010 form from ODHS meets this obligation. The form can be found on the ODHS website. However, ODHS should be forwarding you the signed ROI with your referral. A participant's refusal to sign an ROI must be documented, dated, and kept in the participant file. Participants' refusal to sign such authorization cannot be the basis for denying program services to otherwise eligible participants. Collaboration with ODHS case managers is required for the period of time in which HSP funds are available for expenditure. Subgrantee and subrecipients must track all participants served with HSP funds, including all ODHS referrals related to HSP funding. Another training is available on our dashboard that details the requirements related to referral tracking and reporting. You must use the interagency HSP referral form to facilitate referrals to and from ODHS. That's also available on our dashboard. This form changed for the 25-27 biennium. It's also been distributed to local ODHS districts, but be sure that you are using the most current version. Only referral forms that are fully completed in their entirety meet the requirement for eligibility and eligibility documentation. If a referral form is not fully completed, contact your local ODHS partner and get an amended referral. Collaboration plan templates and referral tracking and reporting templates are also available on our dashboard. Collaboration plans must be submitted and approved by OHCS through the subgrantee's grant agreement funding application. They must be developed in cooperation with the subgrantee and the local ODHS office, and it must be signed and approved by both entities and include the identification of any subrecipients if the subgrantee will further contract the delivery of HSP funds to subrecipients. It must include names, email addresses, and phone numbers of subgrantees and their subrecipients, if applicable, and the ODHS personnel responsible for the development and delivery of the collaboration plan. This can be multiple people, however, the main point of contact for communication with OHCS must be identified for all entities. It must describe how the subgrantee and subrecipient will work with their local ODHS branches to co-case manage clients, and describe how the subgrantee or subrecipient will communicate their TANF participant list and/or referral tracking sheet to their local ODHS branches, the frequency of that communication, which must occur at least monthly, minimally while HSP funds are available. And it must describe the method of communication between the subgrantee and subrecipient and their local ODHS branches. Be sure to include details for specificity, such as the date and times of meetings, how they occur, either phone or electronically, if they're in person, who is responsible for scheduling those collaboration meetings, and what information will be shared. Collaboration plans must include information related to referrals, describing the referral process and include details for specificity, such as how referrals are sent, how contact is made with clients, and what expectations there are for the client, the timeline for how quickly the subgrantee or subrecipient and the local branches will respond, and how action taken on referrals will be communicated to one another, and how the subgrantee or subrecipient will address a crisis need if the frequency of working with their local branches is later than the time needed to address the client situation. It must include a plan for what happens when and if the number of referrals exceed the subgrantee or subrecipient's capacity to take action on those referrals. Collaboration plans must also include transportation plans and describe how the subgrantee or subrecipient will address serving clients with transportation issues if clients are unable to access the subgrantee or subrecipient's physical location, and how such transportation options are communicated to the client. A client service and housing stability plan is needed when a client is receiving more than one-time only assistance, when it is required by the program based on the type of assistance or service provided to the client, and when a subgrantee or subrecipient is unable to assist a client with the entirety of their funding request. For example, a client owes 6 months of rent arrears, and the subgrantee or subrecipient is only able to cover 3 months of that arrears. A plan would be needed to determine how the client will be able to avoid eviction and remain housed so that the 3 months of assistance that's covered by OHCS HSP funds is not just a debt payment, but actually leads to housing stability. Minimally, the client stability plan in this type of a case should document the referrals such as budgeting classes, housing navigation, long-term rent assistance program, SOAR assistance, assistance in obtaining other needed services, connecting clients to SNAP or WIC or other food boxes and resources, and the subgrantee or subrecipient's best effort to assist the client in understanding how they can stabilize their situation. Plans are required to be client-driven, using input and goal setting by the client. An existing and active client service or housing stability plan from other providers, such as ODHS, can be shared and amended for the purposes of HSP funds. Subgrantee and subrecipients can request copies of such assessments and case plans from ODHS for those TANF recipients during their co-case planning meetings. Client service and housing stability plans can include a specific simplified assessment related to housing barriers, and a barriers to housing assistance and assessment plan is available in the sample forms located on the OHCS website. Subgrantee, subrecipient agencies, and their subrecipients must verify that any employee working with HSP households do not have a conviction of child abuse, offenses against person, sexual offenses, child neglect, or other offense bearing a substantial relation to the qualifications, functions, or duties of an employee scheduled to work with HSP households. There must be documentation on file that includes records of such criminal records checks for monitoring purposes. A criminal records check means obtaining and reviewing criminal records and includes any records check obtained by the Oregon State Police using the law enforcement data system or by requesting a national criminal records check where criminal records are obtained from the Federal Bureau of Investigation through the use of fingerprint cards or other identifying information sent to the Oregon State Police or by obtaining a state-specific criminal records check from law enforcement agencies, courts, or other criminal record information resources. While there are various ways of meeting this requirement, please do ensure that you have at least one method of checking criminal history documented in your employee files for every employee having access to HSP households. Applicants are eligible to receive HSP when they are a TANF household. TANF means cash assistance, not a SNAP benefit. Eligible households must be homeless or unstably housed and at or below 185% of the federal poverty guideline. This is not the AMI or area median income. Such income limits are available on the OHCS website, and please note that this income limit is new to align with TANF eligibility. So no longer can you assist clients at an income between 185% and 250% of the federal poverty guideline. Income must always include the current gross income of all adult members of the household. Income earned by minors or full-time students and who are not considered a head of household can be excluded. When we talk about household composition, we mean a family living together as one economic unit. The head of household must have a familial relationship with the eligible dependent child, and minimally, the eligible dependent child must have a social security number. HSP also requires citizenship status to be met, and assisted clients must be a resident of Oregon and intend to remain in Oregon. There are also resource limitations in HSP in which a client cannot exceed $10,000 in available resources. The most simple way of documenting eligibility is through the referral form. When completely filled out and signed by the ODHS partner, it is ODHS that is validating eligibility, not us, not the OHCS recipient. If the household, as victims of domestic violence, need to flee from their current housing situation and they meet Category 4 housing status, HSP can be used for eligible categorical costs associated with moving out of Oregon to a safe location, providing that there is documentation in the client's service or housing stability plan indicating that the client's destination has been confirmed as available safe housing option and that no funds are used for rent, hotel or motel, utilities, or other services in a state other than Oregon. Such allowable costs are restricted to moving costs only. There's more information later in this training regarding allowable costs. Any housing cost provided to the client must be paid directly to the vendor, whether that be the landlord or utility company, etc. Clients are not to receive any direct payments. Housing costs must be supported by documented evidence of need, such as an eviction notice, late notice, or shut-off notice. If any member of the family received HSP assistance in the previous 12 months, the entire family is determined to have received assistance and cannot receive HSP assistance again until a full 12 months after the last date of the assistance payment. Payments for each household are limited to a maximum of $8,000, regardless for what costs are paid. Payments must be made within a 120-day period beginning on the date of the first financial assistance payment and ending 120 days after that date. There is no limit to the number of payments during the 120-day period, as long as all payments are equal to or less than the maximum amount of $8,000, and as long as all payments are for eligible costs and paid within the 120-day period. This is not equal to the number of months for which a household can receive rent or mortgage assistance. For example, a household receives rent assistance for 6 months of arrears, their current rent, and 5 months of future rent for a total of 12 months of rent. However, all those payments must be made within the 120 days in which a client can receive HSP assistance. If a household is receiving more than one-time assistance, they must comply with their HSP case plan or housing stability plan. However, costs related to case management, the program delivery costs, such as housing navigation, can occur before or after the 120-day limitation for financial assistance payments, and it doesn't count towards the 120 days or the $8,000 limitation. Roommate situations are an area where there is a high fraud probability. Anyone can dummy up a rental or a lease agreement and fake receipts. If HSP is to be considered in a situation where roommates occur, the manual provides an abundance of information on how to navigate the complexities of this living situation within this federally funded grant. HSP dollars are not flexible state dollars, and they originate from a federal grant, so we must follow federal guidance. Grantees should never be paying a client directly, and funds should always go directly to the landlord or utility company. However, if there is a legitimate situation in which a tenant A is considered the landlord tenant and tenant B owes tenant A rent, then there must be an authority document in which the actual landlord was approving the living situation. This could be a lease or a rental agreement in which tenant B is listed as an additional occupant, or where tenant B paid the landlord a screening or application fee. Any lease or rental agreement proffered in this living situation must have wet signatures or valid verified digital signatures demonstrating the tenant and landlord relationship between tenant A and tenant B. And this is critically important. There must be documented financial records showing a pattern of financial transactions. Bank statements, money order receipts, PayPal or Venmo statements from tenant B to tenant A for any rent and utility payments. If such evidence does not exist, payments must only be made directly to the actual landlord or utility company rather than to tenant A, and the income of all household members must be included in the eligibility determination, full stop. Handwritten receipts and client self-certifications are not allowable for this purpose due to the high risk of fraud. All records must be kept in the client file for monitoring purposes. Again, always check the manual for allowability of costs under the program. I'll go through these fairly quickly as folks are probably pretty familiar with the guidance. However, housing assistance is meant to provide funds to move a houseless client into permanent housing or to keep a client from losing their permanent housing. Housing assistance is not meant for emergency shelter purposes. Rent and mortgage payments and even assistance for rent or lease to own housing situations are allowable, but must always be for a client's primary residence in which there is a documented lease or rental agreement or loan agreement, and such is verified with valid signatures. There must be a late or past due notice identifying the need. Payments should always be paid directly to the vendor, not the client. Rents can include a tenant's portion of a voucher agreement like Section 8, but cannot include a tenant's portion of a transitional housing agreement. Rent can also include first and last month's rent. Mortgage payments can include the tax payment or taxes may be paid separately. Mortgage payments cannot exceed 6 months of assistance and must be for the purpose of avoiding foreclosure. Rent or lease to own payments also are allowable. However, HSP can only pay the portion relevant to rent. HSP cannot be used to build a client's assets. So payments towards escrow, equity, interest, or tax are not included. Additionally, there must be documented evidence of this split in the cost to ensure that HSP is not being used for the asset building, but only for the rent. As a final note, HSP funds cannot be used so that a client can enter into a lease or rental to own agreement. Rent and lease to own payments would only be allowable under a prevention project. Rent arrearage means past due rent owed to a current landlord. Payment of arrears is restricted to 6 months past due rent, once per period of assistance, that 120 days. A copy of the lease or rental agreement may be necessary in order to determine that any lump sum past due amount does not exceed the 6-month limitation and to validate the tenancy. Previous landlord rental related expenses include other expenses such as rent, filing fees, property damage, court fees, late fees, lease break fees, or unpaid rent, and are owed to a previous landlord or a collection company only when it is required to be paid by the current or prospective landlord. Total expenses cannot exceed 6 months of rent amount charged at the previous unit. There must be documented evidence from the prospective landlord that payment of the arrears is necessary for the participant to obtain permanent housing and maintain stability in that housing. And a unit must be lined up and available for the participant's occupancy if such expenses are to be paid. A case manager's supervisor approval is required for this type of payment before it is issued. Use of a hotel motel voucher or RV space lot must only be for a period of time in which a client is awaiting the readiness of a designated rental unit availability and not as a means of emergency shelter. A permanent housing solution must be lined up and awaiting the client's tenancy. This should never be more than a few days. RV space lots can only be paid under these conditions and are not an alternative housing placement. Utility payments are allowable. However, utility assistance programs must be deferred to first, such as LIHEAP. Utility assistance is only eligible when other utility assistance cannot be obtained, and payment of utility assistance is in the context of and documented in an action plan or goal designed to increase housing stability, along with documentation of the steps taken to defer to other utility assistance first. There must be documented evidence of a utility bill in the participant's name. If paying a utility deposit for a client to obtain or retain services, there must be documented evidence of the need to pay that deposit. Utility arrearage assistance is past due utilities is also allowable. Similar to rent-related expenses, if arrears are owed to a previous utility company or a collection company, these arrears can be paid as well, but only when there is documented evidence from the current utility company that such a payment of those arrears to the previous company is necessary for the participant to obtain or retain utility services. Payment of utility arrears to a previous utility company or collection agency must result in the utilities remaining on or the connection or reconnection of the utility service in the current rental situation. Documentation in the client file must show the steps taken to defer to other utility assistance first. Utility includes water, sewer, garbage, gas, electricity, and other fuel sources when required to be paid by the tenant through a rental or a lease agreement. Utilities does not include phone or internet services, but let's talk about that. Phone services must be in the client's name and must only be provided for one line of service, either a landline or a cellular line, per household, and only when such billing statement clearly identifies the cost of a single line of service, or such cost can be ascertained from the phone service provider. Arrearages are allowed up to 6 months of service in alignment with the limitation of a single line of service. Purchases of phones are unallowable. Connect clients to Oregon Lifeline to meet the need. Internet-related fees and taxes and equipment, like a modem or a router, and rental fees are allowed and must be capped at no more than $300 per biennium and must be in the client's name. Again, use Oregon Lifeline to meet the need. There must be documented evidence in the client housing plan that such service is needed as a means of accessing services, attending required appointments, or for job search. Home repairs can be covered when necessary to make the applicant's housing habitable and if it's less costly than moving to other housing. Documentation in a client's file must show that costs are less costly than moving the client to other housing or that the client is restricted from moving to another housing option and must be made on client-owned property. Home repairs must be minimal to meet habitability standards and not as a means of major repair or rehabilitation. Documentation must include a habitability standards inspection, which is not the same as an HQS or an Inspire inspection. A habitability inspection form for this purpose is available on our website. Pet deposits are allowable under rapid rehousing only. It's not for prevention and it can only be for a single pet. Pet rent is, if it's required as part of the rental or lease agreement, is allowable, but again, only for a single pet, not multiple pets. Food costs as a one-time benefit on an emergency basis when other resources are not available for the service and at a maximum amount of the standard for SNAP benefits for 1 month based on the household side, inclusive any grocery delivery fee for those clients that are homebound are allowable. Clients receiving this service must be connected to SNAP benefits, and if needed, assistance must be given to help a client apply for SNAP benefits. The client file must document the steps taken to ascertain that other food resources were not available to meet the emergent need. As a final note to financial assistance, the manual also covers non-allowable costs. These are areas in which we have likely received questions before, so we do provide a list of those costs that are unallowable for your reference. Again, be sure to review your manual to determine if a cost is allowable or not, and if it is unclear, be sure to check with us prior to approving the cost. Let's pivot now to case management. In HSP, this is the same as program delivery, which is how case management will show up in OPUS. It'll be under a program delivery category. Program delivery is generally the staffing costs associated with providing services to clients. It's one of the primary services offered to families who face multiple challenges to permanent housing. Effective case management includes assessment, planning, implementation, coordination, and evaluation. For HSP specifically, case management does not include the time spent for eligibility determinations. Per TANF rules and regulations, time expended on eligibility determinations cannot be included in case management expenses, but must be attributed to administration costs. This is different than in any of the other OHCSS HSS programs, so do be sure to follow this guidance as closely as possible. Additionally, case management or program delivery is capped at 20% of a subgrantee's total fiscal allocation. Costs may be direct or indirect in accordance with your written cost allocation plan. Case management costs can also occur before and after a client assistant payments begin, and they do not count towards the 120-day timeline. Staffing costs include time expended on providing diversion benefits and services or information to clients, screening and assessment, but not the eligibility determination, developing a housing or a case plan, building relationships with landlords, monitoring a household's progress, connections to income supports, housing navigation, tenant counseling, mediation with landlord, connecting clients to other resources and referral, and costs associated with data entry into HMIS. Unallowable costs include food, candy, treats, or gifts to employees. Due to the nature of HSP, we do not see a lot of use of gift cards in this program. However, I just want to touch on it briefly. The use of gift cards is allowable. However, gift card usage must be rare and within HSP Gift cards can only cover the allowable costs of food as identified in the manual, which would be equal to a single month of SNAP benefits. Gift cards can only be purchased once a gift card policy has been approved by OHCS. More information about using gift cards is in the manual. Now let's move on to the maintenance of effort or the match requirement. I want to first state that to be considered eligible as a match, funds must be made on behalf of an eligible needy family. The MOE funds must have been expended within the 120-day expenditure limitation of HSP, and they must be expended on households that have an income that is at or below 250% of federal poverty level, that have a qualifying dependent child that is a citizen or a qualified non-citizen and are residents of Oregon, and that they have a social security number, or at least the eligible dependent child does, and that the funds were expended to meet one of the four TANF purposes. This is an extremely high bar for a match requirement, and it doesn't usually fit most other program types. The most simple and easy way to carry out the match requirement has been that most CAAs use EHAP for the case management or the program delivery, and they use HSP for the financial assistance for clients that are already eligible under HSP. As case management within HSP is also capped at 20%, this is another good reason and a rationale for using EHAP as the case management costs while allowing HSP to carry the burden of the financial assistance costs. If you choose to meet your match requirement with a different source of funds or in a different way, remember that these eligibility requirements must apply to whatever source of funds that you use. Your MOE obligation is typically provided to you in the allocation workbook that will be released around late May, early June. Countable MOE funds are other state, county, or local government funds or other public or private funds, never federal funds. MOE can be cash or third-party in-kind contributions, such as volunteer services or professional services. The obligation is typically around 20% of your total allocation. If you wish to use in-kind contribution, meaning a non-cash source, then that match must be pre-approved through your funding application. You may need assistance in completing the questions related to non-cash match in the funding application, so feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Remember, if you're using EHAP as your match source, this is not an in-kind, and you will not need to fill out those questions in your funding application. MOE funds must be otherwise counted towards a federal cost sharing or matching requirement. Examples of cash and in-kind MOE can be found on the HSS dashboard. Expenditures counted towards MOE cannot exceed the limitation of assistance as identified for HSP, so $8,000 per client and within the 120-day limitation. You cannot count as MOE any funds that originated with the federal government, state funds expended under the Medicaid program, state funds from a prior fiscal year, or any funds used as MOE for a previous HSP grant. The manual includes much more detailed information on MOE, and there's also an appendix in the manual on frequently asked questions around MOE. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ask. When reviewing the financial management requirements, remember that you or your subrecipient must follow the HSS program standards guidance, such as the fiscal standards. Administration costs are limited to 15% of the total allocation. Administration are costs that benefit the entire organization and cannot be attributed specifically to a particular program, such as executives and board member compensation, IT and HR salaries and compensation, and the operation of facilities. This may include direct or indirect costs. Indirect costs must be in accordance with the organization's written cost allocation plan or the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, the NICRA. and must be consistently applied to all programs in the same manner, whether they are funded by OHCS or not. While we don't provide specific details as to what is a direct or indirect cost, we do provide some general guidance in the manual. Costs associated with the closeout of a grant can be included when incurred, but must be liquidated prior to the due date of the final report, August 30th. Closeout costs include costs associated with completing the final report, submitting final requests for funds, and closing the books within the grantee's organization. This does not apply to any other category of funding in OPUS and applies only to the admin category. Incurred expenses must end under other OPUS categories by June 30. Unallowable admin costs include late fees assessed due to the subgrantee or subrecipient's failure to pay bills in a timely manner, and a subgrantee or subrecipient's facility mortgage payments, and any lobbying efforts or food, candy, treats, or gifts for employees. You will hear this in other trainings, but the spend down of funds is being much more closely monitored, and the scrutiny will continue into this biennium. This is needful as OHCS is expected to report to the legislative body and the governor's office whenever there are questions about how quickly the funds are being expended. If grantees are unable to adhere to the standard spend down plan, grantees can request a time-bound expenditure plan that requires prior approval by OHCS through the submission of the grantee's implementation report. The standard spend down plan is the expenditure of funds, drawing them from OPUS, not just obligating them, but actually drawing them from OPUS. 10% of the funds in the first quarter, 25% of the funds in the second quarter, 60% of the funds in the third quarter, and 90% of the funds expended by May 31st of each year. The May 31st date is at 90% of the fiscal year. That remaining 10% would be expected to be drawn by June 30th or during the closeout period of the grant. The spend down plan tracks only the amount of funds that are drawn from OPUS and does not include the obligation of funds. Grantees will notice that the MGA program elements for the HSS funds require that funds be drawn from OPUS once every 60 calendar days or sooner for every program. This will help grantees stay on track with their spend down plan and ensure that funds are expended during the performance period. OHCS has moved away from individual grant awards in the biennium to avoid rollover issues mid-biennium and to allow grantees the flexibility to expend the allocated funds throughout the entire performance period. While grantees will still receive an additional allocation of funds in the second year of the biennium, this will not be a new grant with a new grant name in OPUS, but it will just be an additional allocation of funds in the existing grant. However, any funds not drawn by 60 days following the funding period will be recaptured by OHCS, and any expenditures not meeting an approved spend down plan are also subject to rescission within the biennium. Remember, HSP deadline to expend funds is actually sooner than other programs due to reporting requirements, and all funds must be drawn from OPUS by July 20th of each fiscal year. Regardless of where we are in the biennium, if grantees fail to meet their spend down plan targets, OHCS may recapture those funds in a timely way so that they can be reallocated to ensure the full expenditure of the grant. Expectations to the recapture of funds is not exceptions to the recapture of funds is not a guarantee. Any exception request must be received by OHCS prior to the 60 days to the date of the FSR is due, and such requests will not be granted for reasons of late invoicing by grantee subrecipients or a grantee's lack of adequate staffing. Both of those issues should be mitigated by the grantee at the time. OHCS acceptance of an exception request will be at the sole discretion of OHCS. As a final note to the spend down of funds, I want to make it very clear and reiterate that HSP funds must be drawn from OPUS by the 20th day following the end of the fiscal year. While the closeout period is 60 days, due to the reporting requirements associated with OHCS agreement with ODHS, we have a much tighter time frame with HSP. You must draw all your funds for the fiscal year by July 20th of that year, not August 30th. There are no extensions and no exceptions. If you wish to receive full reimbursement, be sure to get those draws into OPUS promptly. Again, this pushes the concept that you should draw your funds frequently in OPUS and close out your grants for HSP more quickly than with other programs. There is no expectation in HSP that funds allocated to you must be available throughout the entire year. And in fact, we do encourage you to do quick expenditure of HSP funds as a means to minimize your administrative burden to continue those collaboration plans for the duration of when you have HSP funds. So by expending the funds more quickly, you reduce your administrative burden and help us to meet our deadlines. Remember, if you no longer have any funds available, you do not need to continue your collaboration meetings with ODHS. I won't cover reporting in too great of detail in this training, as there is a specific training module available on our dashboard for HSP referral tracking and quarterly provider reporting. Briefly, the report is required in the form and format provided by OHCS, and a template is available on our dashboard. Reporting must include information from your subrecipients, and it is due by the 20th of the month following the end of the fiscal quarter. That's October 20th, January 20th, April 20th, and July 20th. There are no extensions and no exceptions. Again, this is a very tight timeline, so be sure that you submit your reports in their entirety by the 20th. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be providing my contact information at the end of this training. And I think I may have lost my track in clicking my presentation here, so I do apologize. As a final note, each OHCS manual includes a page that identifies all applicable laws and rules for each program, as well as relevant definitions. Grantees must ensure that they're following all rules and regulations in the program guidance. Definitions are meant to assist grantees when there are questions with how a specific term is identified. So that's it. That wraps up this training for HSP. Don't forget to use our main HSS dashboard. I also recognize that this is a lot of information. However, feel free to watch this information at any time. It will remain on our dashboard for the biennium. You may also connect with us anytime if you have questions by contacting our gatekeeper, or you can contact me directly for any HSP specific questions. And my contact information is on this screen. The PowerPoint presentation will be loaded onto the MGA dashboard along with the recording of this training. Thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day.